Danita Barrett's cause of death had been ruled a homicide. They said it was very clear strangulation.
She was always a show-ducking girl.
911 call came through. The hotel staff had located another body.
It's uncommon to have 2 women killed within a week by asphyxiation. I noticed several cameras facing directly at the room that Ashley was murdered in. We see that the suspect is leaving. He's walking quickly. We need to find out who he is. I want to get this person off the streets immediately.
Danita was living on Annapolis Road with her boyfriend Justin and her 2-year-old son. Her daughter was 5 years old and living with her grandma. But she still made time to see her and be around her. She was a good mom. Danita didn't like her name. She preferred to be called Lexi. We met 2014, 2015, a year before she had her first daughter, and we just never left each other's side after that. She was like my best friend. She was always a show-ducking girl, and we went through like everything together in our teenage years. She was like the realest person you could ever meet. We was planning to see each other. I texted her early in the day just to check on her, and she responded back like she was okay, and I went to work. I didn't hear from her again after that.
Shortly after midnight on March 22nd of 2021, 911 operators told us that we had a suspicious death at Annapolis Road. An adult female was found unresponsive. Primary officer arrived. The civilians on the sidewalk. The victim's sister, they informed him that the deceased, Miss Barrett, was inside the dwelling. He reports Danita was laying in the middle of the floor on her stomach.
EMS are already on the scene.
The medics could not revive her. I get there in maybe 15, 20 minutes after the call. Myself and Detective Scott entered the residence. It appeared that there was no forced entry into the house. Things seemed neat and orderly. Danita's cell phone was next to her body. And we noticed that there was an unwrapped condom in the room. Medical examiners examined Miss Barrett's body on the floor. The body was in full rigor mortis, so we assumed it had been there probably at least 8 to 12 hours. The medical examiner didn't find any injuries that you could see with the naked eye. It left us a little puzzled as far as the cause of death.
Let me know what you find.
But I felt in my gut that it wasn't natural.
Detective McDonald heads outside to speak to the victim's sister, Diana.
Tell me what happened here.
She informed us that she was brought to the location by Danita's boyfriend, Justin. And he's the one that actually discovered Danita's body.
Go on.
He told Danita's sister that he had gone over to the house. There were no lights on. He actually tripped over the body.
Instead of calling 911, Justin phoned Anita's brother and sister.
What?
And then they went to the location. After they went in and saw the body, her brother called 911.
Justin fled the scene soon after.
We were informed Justin had been in a car parked across the street, but prior to our arrival, he left the scene.
He just drove off.
Danita's sister knew the boyfriend's first name was Justin. And that's all the information she had.
Okay. What else can you tell me about Danita?
Danita's sister was very candid in telling us that Danita was a prostitute, that she utilized her house there on Annapolis Road as a place to meet her customers. I can only surmise one of two things happened. She was either killed by a customer or she was killed by Justin. Danita had only been prostituting for about 6 months, and that she was doing it solely to provide a better life for her and her son. She assured me that the only substance that Danita had ever used was marijuana.
Okay. Thank you. McDonald.
I got a phone call from the OCME's office, and they informed me that Danita's cause of death had been ruled a homicide by asphyxiation. They said it was very clear it was strangulation.
The news of Danita's death spreads fast.
My cousin called me like, yeah, oh my God, Dad, I'm sorry I gotta be the person to tell you, but Lexi is gone, yeah. So I'm crying, and like, me and her have been through so much together. And I'm asking her, like, what happened? She couldn't really tell me what happened. I'm thinking, like, oh my gosh, like, she just had her son. Like, she didn't even get to watch him grow up and see neither one of her children grow to their teenage years, take them to school, or none of that.
Two detectives from my squad did an area canvass, and they spoke to a young lady who lived several doors down from Danita's house. She informed them that approximately a year ago, Danita and her boyfriend had gotten into a loud altercation that ended with hands put on her neck, but they didn't know of a police report and if anything ever became of it. Justin became more of a person of interest, so we had our homicide operations unit start looking for Justin.
No more neighbors come forward with information, so investigators look for electronic witnesses.
Detectives canvassed the area to find ring cameras or store surveillance cameras. Hopefully we could see someone going in the house, and they also informed me of a CCTV camera, city-owned, at the top of the block of Annapolis Road in front of the firehouse. Danita's house is probably several hundred yards away from this camera.
While they wait for access to the CCTV footage, investigators examine the items recovered from Danita's home.
Detectives had searched the home and found her cell phone. They had requested a warrant to look through her phone to figure out who she had last been in communication with.
Cell phones are a wealth of information, but almost all phones now have passcodes. Believe it or not, it's more common than you would think. People use either their birthday, their kid's birthday. So I used Danita's child's birthday, which actually opened the phone.
There were a lot of calls and missed and unanswered text messages. But there was a text conversation in Miss Barrett's phone that was the last message that she had responded to. She had directed somebody who was planning on meeting her to her neighbor's house, to their back door, rather than to her address. I would think she wanted to see who was going to be meeting her before that person knew where she lived.
It's a customer she actually wants to date. And then she'd call them over and then utilize the back door of her residence instead of the front door. That way, you know, your neighbors don't see people coming and going in the front of the house. Danita had never responded to any more messages after 1:40. There were a lot of incoming, but she never responded to them.
Hey, I've got a time frame.
They gave us a time of 1:40 as approximately the time that we believe the assault had occurred. ran that number through our databases in the department.
Yeah. Can you run a number for me?
While they wait for the results of the check, investigators analyze the CCTV footage.
Go to the Annapolis Road camera and start at 140.
This particular camera we had on Annapolis Road, it panned from one location and it would go around before it came back again.
Punch in there.
As we were watching the CCTV cameras, as it panned down towards Danita's house, we saw an individual several hundred yards down the street. We were watching the CCTV pan down towards Danita's house. The distance was so great that we couldn't tell if the individual was going to her house.
Can you clean it up?
We couldn't get a good description of the person, even what they were wearing. It's close to the time where we think the time of death was. So we were a little excited that maybe if this person had left the house and walked back up towards the camera, hopefully we could see this person again. When our cameras are rotating, you more or less hold your breath for the next rotation.
It usually takes about 45 seconds for the camera to rotate fully around. Sometimes the camera footage is so frustrating, right? When you need it to be on one side of the street and the camera is inevitably on the other side of the street.
They're gone.
We never saw him come back out of the house. We assumed it probably was one of the neighbors.
Okay, let's keep looking through it.
We kind of concentrated on the time between 1:30 and 2:30 down Annapolis Road. We knew she wasn't using the front door for her customers, but we were hoping we'd see something, maybe someone stop out front and then go around the back of the house. My partner noticed a delivery van coming out of an alley. Directly underneath, or pretty much underneath, a CCTV camera in front of the firehouse.
That's odd.
It's very uncommon for people to drive in these alleys in this area. There's a lot of debris and trash in the alleys. Once it pulled out, it made a right turn on Annapolis Road, and it appeared to stop in front of Danita's house. We never see anyone get out of the vehicle or go back into the vehicle.
Punch in on the plate. I can't read it.
It was parked there for longer than you would expect a delivery truck to be.
10, 15 minutes later, that vehicle leaves from in front of Danita's house, makes a U-turn on Annapolis Road. And drives up, back underneath the camera, and out of sight of the camera.
They asked me to subpoena the records from that retail company to see if they could figure out which truck had been in the area at that time and maybe who had been driving it. The company did not have GPS tracking on their van, so we weren't able to determine who had been driving the truck at that time.
Once the van pulls away, you're a little disappointed that it didn't capture what you hoped it would have captured. Seeing Danita alive, would have been a great help as far as closing the timeline in, but we never saw her enter or exit the house.
The footage from the fire station camera reveals no further leads.
There was a camera opposite Danita's house, across the street,
Play this.
that also had some video. Annapolis Road is like 6 lanes across, so it's a good distance across the road. It's not just a smaller city street. The system was so neglected that images really weren't that clear.
Detective McDonald receives notification of a breakthrough in identifying Danita's boyfriend, Justin.
We obtained a screenshot of Justin. We used facial recognition through the Baltimore City Police Department. We identified Justin as Justin Powell. We ran him through Baltimore City databases, and it was established that he had an open warrant for handgun violation.
The medical examiner shares the results of Danita's autopsy with investigators.
There was evidence of sexual activity on her body, so we knew that the person that had strangled her had engaged in some sort of sexual activity with her. When you have a sexual component to a crime, you do look towards the domestic partner first. Strangulation has a very personal component to it. You are literally taking the life out of somebody with your own hands.
I was pretty confident Justin was the suspect.
I need a warrant for Justin Powell.
I passed this information on to the Warrant Apprehension Task Force and Homicide Operations, and they went out to search for Mr. Powell. He's now our #1 suspect in the murder of Danita Barrett.
Meantime, Danita's family and friends gather for her funeral.
Danita was well known in the neighborhood. A whole bunch of people came, more than I expected. When her daughter walked up to her casket, her daughter broke down. It was the saddest thing. It was the saddest thing like you could ever see. Like, she asked, "Is that my mommy?" And then just broke down crying. I just started crying. It was so sad. It was so sad. It was so sad.
The Warrant Apprehension Task Force is still trying to locate Justin when 911 receives another call.
This is Baltimore City 911. What's the address of your emergency?
911 call came through hotel staff at the Deluxe Plaza off of Pulaski Highway. Had located another body.
On March 28, 2021, a patrol officer was dispatched to the Deluxe Plaza Motel in Baltimore. The motel staff advised that they went to a guest's room who had not checked out on time. They knocked on the door, and after receiving no answer, they used a room key to enter the room. Upon entering the room, they found a deceased female on the ground. The officer notified the homicide unit. We're not sure what we're gonna find when we get there. I get to the room. There's a deceased female laying face down on the ground next to the bed, still wearing clothes. I don't notice any signs of trauma or foul play. There was an empty pill bottle and a drug paraphernalia.
Initially, they thought maybe it was a drug overdose because there was some evidence in the hotel room of recent drug use.
The medical investigator arrives. The victim is rolled over and the body is examined. The victim was strangled and the larynx was broken. I would start looking around the room to help identify the victim. We located a credit card which had the name Ashley Lambert, as well as a cup from Dunkin' Donuts. This time in the investigation, we need to find the family of Ashley Lambert to notify them of her death. We check the police database and we find out that she has family in a neighboring county.
Ashley was at one time my wife, and she is my children's mother. She was very caring and kind and sweet, and she was also really good with children.
My mom, she was very outgoing. She loved to be with family. She really loved to hang out with her kids. She was very open, and she made you feel like you could talk to her about anything, you know. I was never nervous to ever tell her anything. She loved making people feel special.
She was outgoing, opinionated, funny, happy, but she dealt with mental illness. She would go through different periods in her life, but even through all that, she, always tried to be the best mother, tried to be the best wife, daughter, friend.
Ashley started struggling with drugs, which is why the children came to stay with me and why her sons were with her grandparents. She always hoped to get her own place and for the kids to come back to stay with her. She had tried to get help with rehab. It wasn't successful. It's very hard to kick a habit like that. She was a beautiful, kind-hearted person.
In Baltimore, it's uncommon to have 2 women killed within a week, both being found in a room by themselves and both being strangled.
Danita Barrett. It was a very similar case. My job at this juncture is to find Danita's boyfriend, our #1 suspect, Justin, and bring him in for questioning.
Back at the Deluxe Plaza, investigators search for clues that could identify Ashley's killer.
Now that we know this is a murder, it's time to step up the investigation. We need to find witnesses, evidence, video footage to help capture this killer. I noticed that the motel is equipped with several cameras to include the lobby as well as the parking lot, facing directly at the room that Ashley was murdered in. We go back to the security room of the motel where we can now view all the cameras.
That hotel has several cameras. They have one camera near the check-in area. They have one camera that overlooks the parking lots where the doors to the hotel rooms are.
I noticed it's a decent video system. The cameras are not equipped with sound, but you can see clear pictures.
Okay, can you start from where you last saw her?
So I watched the video to find out when the person was last seen alive, to show what led up to the death of Ashley Lambert.
Okay, there she is. You pause it there.
At this time, it was 2:03 p.m. on March 27th.
Okay, just keep it playing.
And I see an individual walking quickly.
Back it up.
An individual in a hoodie and camouflage backpack walks up to the door carrying a white bag.
Zoom in there.
He knocks on the door. Ashley Lambert answers. After a brief conversation, he's led in the room. I continue watching, and the next thing I see is this individual leaving the room approximately 25 minutes later. Seeing that this individual is in the room for only 25 minutes, and now he's leaving the room, walking away quickly, it looks very suspicious to me.
Can you enlarge it?
The hoodie he's wearing is partially covering his face, and the camera footage is not clear enough to identify him. It's frustrating. Not seeing anyone else enter or exit that room, now we know that this individual is our potential killer.
Can you follow him?
I discovered there is an additional camera in the front of the building. This camera showed the entrance to the motel. I noticed that he had a red hoodie and he's standing at a vending machine, digging through his backpack. I could see his face, and it was covered by a mask, but I could tell it was dark-skinned. And the individual walks eastbound on Pulaski Highway, out of the view of the camera footage.
I need a copy of this. And can you bring up the details of who rented the room?
She wasn't the one that rented the room. The room had been rented by a male. He had signed the rental paperwork and had rented the room initially for one night. The detectives learned that he extended the room for a second night.
The hotel staff provided us the name of the person who rented the room, and his name is Michael. The motel provided information on how he paid for the room, as well as his address and phone number. Now we need to find Michael as soon as possible to find out if he's responsible for the death of Ashley. We get to Michael's house and knock on the door. It's in the back of your mind that this could be the potential killer. You have to be careful. You don't know what to expect. You just go in prepared and be ready for anything. Michael answers.
G'day, sir. Can I ask you a couple questions?
He did not match the description of the last individual seen leaving the room. Michael comes outside with us, tries to get us away from his house. He seems a bit nervous. At this time, he explains to us that his wife and newborn child are inside the house. He explains that he met Ashley on a dating app, met her at a hotel because he likes to get high. He rented the room the first night, hung out with Ashley, they partied, and he said he left in the morning.
What about the second night?
He later came back to the motel, and Ashley asked him if he would rent the motel for one more night because she had no place to stay. Michael paid for the room.
Did you go back again?
Michael said the last time he saw Ashley was March 27th, the day before Ashley was found murdered. I believe what Michael was telling us. If Michael is not the killer,
that the footage from the motel again?
Then we need to find out who is. I want to make sure we get this person off the streets immediately. At this time, I continue watching the video footage to find more clues.
Can you punch in there?
I noticed that the man in the red hoodie is carrying a small white pastry bag before he enters Ashley's room. I need to find out where he purchased this item, which could lead me to additional footage and hopefully his identification. I watched the video footage and I saw the direction where he came from before entering Ashley's room.
Can you bring up the map?
Knowing that this individual in the red hoodie is walking, we wanted to find a location that was within walking distance. And we noticed that there was 2 locations, a liquor store and a Dunkin' Donuts. They were only a few hundred yards away.
Inside of the hotel room, there was a styrofoam coffee cup from Dunkin' Donuts. So they went to the Dunkin' Donuts.
I immediately noticed that they had cameras on the outside of the establishment. I asked the manager if we could view the footage.
Can you start at 1:30 on the 28th?
They were able to see the same person wearing the same clothing approaching the Dunkin' Donuts 30 minutes before we see this person entering Ashley's room.
Camera footage shows the individual in the red hoodie from before, but is not clear enough to show his face, and he's still wearing a mask before he entered.
Detectives show a picture of the suspect to the restaurant staff. A waitress recalls serving him on the day of Ashley's murder.
Did he make that purchase with cash, or did he use a credit card? Because if he used the credit card to pay for this item, we have a better chance of tracking him down.
Can you get me those transaction details?
Dunkin' Donuts was able to go back into their system and regenerate the receipt that had the credit card information for that purchase.
Because of legal reasons, Dunkin' Donuts is not allowed to give us the information about the person who made the purchase.
I then had to subpoena the bank in order to get the actual records from the bank to show who that bank account belonged to.
Meantime, investigators on the Danita Barrett case receive a list of names from the numbers on the victim's cell.
I've got a hit on the phone.
Detective McDonnell learns the name of the last person to text Danita.
And it came back with a result, and that result was a gentleman called Christopher Tyson. We ran a background check on him because he wasn't a convicted felon. In this database, there were other run-ins he had with different entities, whether it be law enforcement or school, but he did have a past.
I might have a lead.
Up to now, investigators have focused on finding Danita's boyfriend, Justin Powell.
Now I'm like a 50-50. Could it be Justin? Could it be Christopher Tyson? So I was pretty much split down the middle. It could be either one at this juncture. We established that Christopher Tyson had called police himself for a domestic incident, which he was assaulted. That's what he reported. We wanted to talk to the girlfriend who supposedly assaulted him and try to get some background on Mr. Tyson. So myself and my partner responded out to the county to find his girlfriend.
Hi. Heard ask you about Christopher Tyson.
She was not at home at the time, but we spoke to the girlfriend's mother. who told us where Mr. Tyson worked.
Is there anything else you can tell us about it?
He worked for a well-known retailer. That was significant because we saw the van owned by that company on the CCTV creeping out of the alley, stopping and parking in front of Danita's house at the approximate time that we thought the murder had occurred.
The woman tells detectives that her daughter was charged with no crime in connection with the alleged assault on Tyson.
She also said that she thought that he had anger management problems.
Thank you for your time.
Investigators contact the retailer to find out Tyson's position within the company.
Can you tell me what role Christopher Tyson did for you?
His management at his place of employment, they said he was not a driver. He was only working the warehouse. He didn't have access to the trucks. We were unable to rule out 100% that he didn't have access to the vehicle, but at this juncture, I had no proof that he could have taken one of their vehicles.
While investigators work out how Christopher Tyson connects to Danita Barrett's murder, the detectives on the Ashley Lambert case receive a hit on the bank card used in Dunkin' Donuts.
Once we obtained the subpoena, it only took a few days to find out the name of the person who made that purchase. And the name of the person that used the card was Christopher Tyson.
Tyson?
Detective Steve McDonald sits diagonal from me, and I remember saying that, oh, we have the name of Christopher Tyson. He then says, wait.
I've got that name on my file.
At that juncture, I felt confident that Christopher Tyson had also committed the murder of Danita Barrett.
At this point in the investigation, Detective McDonald and I start to work together. Now we need to bring Christopher Tyson in for questioning. We obtained his phone information, and we obtained an order to track his cell phone.
Got it. Let's roll.
His phone was tracked to 2000 block of Bryant Street. A search and seizure warrant was obtained for Christopher's house. The feeling you get when you're about to enter a house where a potential suspect is for murder, you get a little fired up. We went to the location, surrounded the house. You get a little excited, a little nervous. You're hoping that they're in there. We execute that search and seizure warrant. When officers entered his room,
Hey!
And we locate Christopher Tyson in the second floor front bedroom. He was found hiding under the bed.
It's your hands! It's your hands!
He was then secured without incident.
Fuck! Get up! Get hands behind your back. Get it back.
He is then brought down to the homicide office for questioning.
Let's get out. Let's go.
At this time, I conduct the search warrant of Christopher's room. I'm looking for any evidence, anything that will help solve this case.
They knew that they were looking for a backpack that had pretty unique patterns on it, and they were looking for a reddish-brown sweatshirt that he may have been wearing.
And we did locate the camouflage backpack. And within that backpack was Ashley Lambert's phone.
And they found what they believed to be the sweatshirt in the surveillance video. They did find the credit card that Mr. Tyson had used to make the purchase. The numbers matched up on the receipt. They also found a bag full of women's underwear.
It's not common for a murder suspect to keep items from a murder. They don't want to be connected to the murder at all. But I felt like Christopher Tyson was keeping these items almost as a trophy.
Detective Moran interviewed Mr. Tyson first.
Do you know Ashley Lambert?
Christopher is questioned about the murder of Ashley Lambert. At first, he denies even knowing her, denies being at that motel. But at this point, we show him a picture of the individual that caught on camera footage wearing the red hoodie and backpack.
Is that you?
He immediately points that out as being himself. As we presented with more and more evidence, he starts to break. Finally, Christopher tells us that he met Ashley on a dating app. He said when he got to the hotel, Ashley was making fun of him, at which he took offense to.
He described it as she started getting angry at him, and that's when he described that he choked her.
He said that before he left the motel, he checked for her pulse, and she was still alive. He then left the area. At that point, him admitting that he strangled her and he was the last person to be seen with her, I was confident that he killed her. Detective Steve McDonald comes in next.
I go in there and sit in and talk to Mr. Tyson.
So what can you tell me about Danita Barrett?
It's pretty much the same scenario. Mr. Tyson denied ever being in Westport. I'd show him the text messaging.
What about these text messages?
He said, yes, I was in there. You know, I had sex with Miss Barrett, and she made fun of me. We got into an altercation, and I just choked her out. And as I left, I checked her pulse, and she was alive. Maybe someone else killed her after I left. And when we was talking about these people's deaths, he didn't have a lot of emotion. I thought in my mind there could be more women out there that this guy has assaulted and or killed.
They asked him, have you done this before? And he said something to the effect of, well, why don't you tell me who else you think that I hurt?
He implicated himself enough, and with the corroborating evidence we already had, he's charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Tyson pleaded guilty to the murder of Miss Barrett and the murder of Miss Lambert.
Tyson enters a special plea that admits the evidence against him would likely result in his conviction. He receives 2 life sentences. Prosecutors charged Danita Barrett's boyfriend, Justin Powell, with no crimes in connection to her death.
I wish every case had a camera pointed directly at my crime scene. That CCTV camera footage, it was the strongest evidence that we could find to show that no one else could have committed this crime. Had he been left on the street for any longer, I have no doubt that there would have been another victim.
I think we definitely took a budding serial killer off the streets of Baltimore.
It's nothing you can do to make up for my best friend's death. I miss our talks. She was my motivation. She was my inspiration. She kept me on my toes, and we kept each other laughing.
Ashley didn't deserve what was done to her. She was taken from her entire family way too soon.
The fog hangs heavy over the cobblestones of London, a city that keeps its secrets locked behind iron gates and damp, Victorian brickwork, but even the deepest shadow cannot hide a crime that has waited nearly 50 years to breathe. It starts not with a body, but with a whisper caught in the binding of a forgotten journal, a dusty, leather-bound artifact discovered in the attic of a dilapidated estate in Kensington. The ink is faded, the pages brittle, but the words carved into that paper are sharp enough to cut through the silence of decades. Imagine, if you will, the investigator's hand trembling as he turns the page, his breath catching in his throat as he realizes he is holding the blueprint of a nightmare. This was the London of 1978, a city of flickering street lamps and long, lonely walks through the damp, an era where a person could simply vanish into the gray expanse of the Thames mist without leaving a single trace. The victim, a young woman with a future as bright as the city lights, had stepped out into the night and never returned, leaving behind a family shattered by the cruel, grinding gears of an investigation that sputtered and died. Year after year, the file grew heavy with dust, a monument to failure, a cold case that the police force had relegated to the back of the cabinet, convinced that the killer had long since slipped through their fingers into the afterlife. But secrets have a way of surviving. They have a way of lying in wait until the right light hits the right page. This is the story of that diary, a window into a past that was never meant to be opened, and the terrifying, calculated truth that had been hiding in plain sight, protected by nothing more than the passage of time and the complacency of those who thought they were safe. The scene, even after all these years, remains etched in the collective memory of the local precinct, a rain-slicked alley, a discarded handbag, the chilling stillness of a morning that should have been mundane but instead became the genesis of a haunting. There were no witnesses, no frantic calls for help, just the sudden, jarring absence of a life that had been brimming with potential. Neighbors looked out their windows at the flashing blue lights, their faces pale behind lace curtains, unaware that the darkness they saw was not passing through, but had settled into the foundation of their very streets. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in frustration, a series of dead ends and missed opportunities that left the detectives clawing at thin air. They chased shadows, they questioned suspects who smiled with the confidence of the untouchable, and they watched as the trail went cold, turning from a burning search into a flickering, dying ember. The community, once connected by the comfort of shared safety, began to pull apart, every locked door and bolted window a testament to the fear that had taken root in the soil of their neighborhood. They stopped talking to the police, they stopped looking at the strangers who passed them on the street, and they began to live in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the monster to strike again, only for him to never reappear. It was the perfect crime, executed with a clinical, detached precision that suggested the killer was not a stranger, but someone who understood the rhythm of their lives, someone who knew exactly where to stand to remain invisible. As the years dragged on, the diary sat in that dark, undisturbed attic, a ticking time bomb of truth waiting for the hand of fate to trigger it. The investigator, who finally found it, wasn't even looking for a crime. He was settling an estate, clearing out the remnants of a life that had long since ended. He didn't know that the loose floorboard he pried up was the key to unlocking a generation of grief. As he pulled the diary from its hiding place, he heard the faint, ghostly rustle of paper that had not felt the touch of a human hand since the late 70s. The first entry he read chilled him to the marrow. It was a chronicle of observations, a detailed, meticulous record of the victim's movements, written with an intimacy that felt like a violation. This wasn't just a journal, it was a hunter's ledger, a record of the predator's patience, documenting every heartbeat, every smile, every hesitant step taken by a girl who had no idea she was being stalked. The investigator, a man hardened by decades of service, found himself unable to pull his eyes away from the script, his heart hammering against his ribs as the implications crystallized in his mind. The killer had been in the room, he had been at the table, he had been the shadow in the doorway, and he had written it all down as if he were composing a masterpiece. The journey from the discovery of the diary to the moment of arrest is a blur of adrenaline, clandestine meetings, and the terrifying realization that the monster was not just a name in a book, but a man who had continued to walk the streets of London, shielded by his own mundanity. Forensic teams were mobilized in absolute secrecy, their movements masked by the hum of the city, as they began the process of verifying the diary's contents against the cold case files. The handwriting matched. The dates correlated with the original investigation's timeline, and the location, described with a sickening level of detail, linked the writer directly to the alleyway where the nightmare began. Every forensic expert who touched the pages felt the same jolt of repulsion, the same grim satisfaction that the killer's arrogance had finally become his undoing. He had not just committed the crime, he had kept the souvenir of his own malice, a testament to his belief that he had successfully outwitted the law for 47 years. The arrest, when it finally occurred on a rainy Tuesday morning, was a surgical strike, a moment of profound, quiet tension that stood in stark contrast to the violence of the act that had triggered it. They found him in a quiet flat, surrounded by the debris of an ordinary life, his face etched with the lines of time, a man who had clearly long since forgotten the girl he had destroyed. The shock that rippled through the city when the news broke was not just a ripple, it was a tidal wave of realization that left everyone gasping for air. The community, which had spent nearly half a century believing the truth was lost to the wind, were suddenly forced to confront the reality that the killer had been a fixture of their world, a man who had perhaps even attended the very memorials held for the girl he had murdered. The media descended like a plague of locusts, their cameras capturing the face of the man who had been a ghost for so long, and the public reaction was one of profound, soul-shaking disbelief. Families who had grown up in the shadow of the cold case suddenly saw their own history in a new, terrifying light, questioning every neighbor, every friend, and every memory that had ever seemed normal. The veil had been torn away, and what lay beneath was a reality far more disturbing than the rumors that had circulated for decades. The police, suddenly thrust into the spotlight, had to manage not just the trial, but the overwhelming, collective trauma of a city that was finally learning the name of its shadow. The trial itself was a gruesome excavation of the past, a slow-motion unraveling of the killer's carefully constructed silence. Every day brought new revelations, each one more harrowing than the last, as the diary was projected onto the courtroom screens, its handwritten lines becoming the evidence that would finally cement the truth. The defendant, a man who had mastered the art of being unremarkable, sat motionless, his expressionless face becoming a symbol of the banality of evil. He watched as his own words, written in a surge of youthful, narcissistic malice, were picked apart by the prosecution, their power to terrify only growing with the passage of time. The courtroom, packed to the rafters, was a place of breathless, heavy tension, where every word spoken felt like a physical blow against the silence that had governed the case for so long. The jury, a group of ordinary citizens chosen to represent the weight of a city's conscience, listened to the forensic experts explain how the ink, the paper, and the very structure of the diary proved that the man before them was the architect of a tragedy that had never been allowed to fully end. The victim's family, who had lived their lives in the long, dark shadow of their daughter's disappearance, finally found their voice, their testimonies ringing out through the chamber with a clarity that was both beautiful and heart-wrenching. They did not just talk about the loss. They talked about the phantom life that had been taken away, the laughter that had been silenced, and the emptiness that had become their permanent companion. They looked at the defendant, not with a fire of rage, but with the cold, steady gaze of those who had carried the burden of the truth for 47 years. Their courage was the light that finally pierced the gloom, a testament to the enduring power of memory in the face of absolute, systemic indifference. The jury, visibly moved by the raw reality of the pain, began their deliberations in a room where the air felt thick with the weight of decades, every second an echo of the life that had been cut short in that rainy, forgotten alleyway. When the verdict finally fell, a single word that rang out like a gunshot, it didn't just end a trial, it punctuated a chapter of history that had been written in blood and kept in the dark.
Guilty.
The words seemed to hover, a final, definitive period at the end of a long, tortured sentence. A wave of profound, exhausted relief washed over the gallery, a collective release of tension that had been building since 1978. The killer, finally shorn of his mask, was led away, a small, insignificant man whose hubris had been his undoing. But the victory felt hollow, a grim reminder of the price of silence and the terrifying ease with which a life can be erased from the world. The cold case was solved, the ledger was closed, but the city would never be the same again, for it now possessed the knowledge of its own fragility and the understanding that some secrets are never truly gone. They are just waiting for someone to be brave enough to open the page. The aftermath of the conviction felt less like a celebration and more like a period of mourning as the city began to process the sheer scale of the horror that had been hidden in plain sight. Every corner of London, every shadow-drenched alley, every silent street now felt like a repository of the past, a landscape mapped by the memory of the crime. The investigators, who had spent their careers chasing a ghost, were left with the sobering reality of what they had found and the nagging, persistent question of how many other secrets remained buried in the attic of the world. They were the keepers of the history, the ones who would carry the weight of the diary long after the news cycle had moved on and the public had forgotten the name of the man behind the bars. The trial had concluded, but the story was far from finished. It had merely been transcribed from a private, handwritten confession into the public record, a permanent, inescapable part of the city's heart. As the years continue to turn, the legacy of the diary will remain, a reminder that the truth is not a static thing, but a living, breathing force that will eventually claim its place in the light. It serves as a warning, a whisper in the ears of those who think they can commit an act of evil and vanish, and a beacon for the families who are still waiting for their own cold cases to break. The London of today is a different place, a city of steel and glass, but beneath the surface, it is still the same, built on the same foundations of hidden things and forgotten lives. The diary is now a piece of evidence, a sterile, cold object behind glass, but its words continue to vibrate with the intensity of the man who wrote them, a voice from the past that refuses to be silenced, a testament to the fact that no matter how long the shadow, the day will eventually dawn. In the final, quiet hours of the night, when the fog rolls in off the Thames and the city settles into its fitful sleep, the story of the diary feels like something more than just a crime. It feels like a pulse, a rhythm that dictates the heartbeat of the London that was and the London that is. It is a story of patience, of the long, slow, grinding necessity of justice, and of the terrifying, beautiful realization that we are all, in some way, connected by the things we cannot forget. The girl from 1978, the man who hunted her, and the diary that linked them across the span of a lifetime, they are all part of the same, singular, haunting narrative, a tapestry of loss and recovery that will continue to define the city long after we are all gone. This is the truth that the diary left behind, that the shadows are not empty, they are full of the things we have left undone, and they will wait, for as long as it takes, for the light to finally, inevitably, find them. The arrest of the man from the diary, a name that had never once surfaced in the frantic, disorganized leads of 1978, sent a tremor through the foundations of the Metropolitan Police that felt like a seismic shift. The investigators, now standing in the center of a storm they had spent 47 years praying for, found themselves confronted not just with the guilt of a killer, but with the chilling reality of their own institutional failures. As they sat in the interrogation rooms, the fluorescent lights buzzing with a sound that felt like a dying nerve, they opened the second volume of the killer's private chronicle. It was not merely a diary, it was a map of a hunting ground. The pages were dense with observations, street addresses, and descriptions of the city that transformed London from a historical setting into a predatory landscape. He had been a phantom, a man who blended into the commute, the cafes, and the casual evening strolls, his existence anchored by the very people he watched with the cold, detached hunger of a wolf. The interrogations were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The suspect, a man who had spent nearly 5 decades practicing the art of appearing ordinary, initially played the part of the confused, aging retiree. He spoke of his life in terms of suburban banalities, his interest in gardening, his volunteer work at the local community center, his reputation as a quiet, unassuming man who would offer his umbrella to a stranger in the rain. Yet, with every page of the diary they presented to him, the facade cracked. The investigators leaned into the silence, letting the tension coil in the room until it was so taut it threatened to snap. When he finally spoke, his voice was a dry, rasping instrument that seemed to have forgotten the art of human empathy. He didn't confess to the crime. He described it as a moment of architectural necessity, a cold, abstract term that turned the victim into a prop in his own unfolding narrative. As the weeks of interrogation deepened, the detectives began to realize that the 1978 incident was not a singular, isolated explosion of violence. The diary contained references to other names, other dates, and other locations, vague, cryptic entries that hinted at a trail of destruction stretching across the entire United Kingdom. The fear that had initially settled upon the city following the arrest now evolved into a broader, national dread. They were not just looking at a cold case solved. They were looking at the potential discovery of a serial predator who had successfully operated under the radar for nearly half a century. The magnitude of this realization turned the precinct into a hive of frantic activity, with task forces being formed, historical files being exhumed from the depths of the National Archives, and forensic teams racing against the clock to link the killer to incidents that had long ago been dismissed as accidents or missing persons cases. The emotional toll on the investigative team was immense. They were working 18-hour days, fueled by stale coffee and the crushing weight of the potential bodies they had yet to find. They had been prepared to close the book on 1978, but they found themselves forced to keep writing, digging into the past with a ferocity that bordered on the obsessive. Each lead that checked out, each confirmation of his presence in a city at the time of a suspicious death, felt like a hammer blow against the collective morale of the squad. They were witnessing the systematic unmasking of a monster who had built his life on the ruins of others, a man who had lived to a ripe old age while his victims had remained frozen in the perpetual youth of their final moments. The injustice of it was a bitter, burning sensation that shadowed them even when they left the station, following them into their homes and into their own dreams. The public reaction, initially centered on the shock of the arrest, began to pivot toward a demand for a comprehensive reckoning. Protests broke out in front of the police headquarters, with families of the long missing and the unsolved calling for the authorities to open every file, to re-examine every lead, and to finally give them the answers they had been denied for so long. The case had become a beacon, a symbol of the possibility of justice in an age where the past is often assumed to be beyond reach. The diary, despite the court's order to keep its contents confidential, became a lightning rod for the city's pain. It represented the power of the written word to outlast the memory of the living, to serve as an immutable record of things that were never meant to be heard. The investigators, caught in the middle of this public outcry, felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of being the stewards of this dark history. Inside the trial prep rooms, the atmosphere was a complex, tangled web of logic and emotion. They were building a case that relied not just on the diary, but on the painstaking reconstruction of a life that had been designed to leave no tracks. They interviewed men he had worked with in the 80s, women he had dated in the 90s, and neighbors who had lived on either side of him for 30 years. Everyone described the same man, helpful, reserved, occasionally distant, but never once appearing like a predator. The dissonance between the man the world knew and the man described in the diary was a source of constant, gnawing anxiety for the detectives. It forced them to confront their own limitations, their own inability to truly read the souls of the people they passed on the street. It was a humbling, terrifying lesson in the nature of human evil. The victim's family, meanwhile, had begun to navigate the complex process of facing their daughter's killer in a court of law. They were no longer the grief-stricken parents of 1978. They were people who had hardened, who had built their lives around the core of their loss, and who were now standing on the threshold of an ending they had almost ceased to believe in. They became the public face of the investigation, their steady, dignified presence in the media and in the courtroom a stark counterpoint to the chaotic, swirling energy of the city. They were the ones who carried the moral weight of the case, the ones who provided the grounding force that allowed the investigators to keep moving forward when the complexity of the diary became too much to process. As the date of the trial drew nearer, the killer began to change. The stoic, impassive mask he had worn during the early interrogations began to slip. He started to complain of health issues. He began to challenge the legality of the diary's acquisition, and he engaged in a series of legal maneuvers that were clearly designed to drag the process out until his own mortality intervened. He was a man who had spent 47 years evading capture, and he was determined to use every weapon in his arsenal to ensure he never faced the full, raw consequences of his actions. The detectives watched this with a grim, knowing silence. They had seen his kind before, the predators who view the legal system not as a place of justice, but as a game to be played, a maze to be navigated with the same clinical detachment they applied to their crimes. The diary itself became the focal point of a massive, intellectual battle. The defense argued that it was a work of fiction, a diary written by a man with an overactive, dark imagination, a creative exercise that had been misinterpreted as a confession. It was a desperate, grasping argument, but it forced the prosecution to build an airtight, bulletproof case that left no room for interpretation. They brought in handwriting experts, linguists who analyzed the syntax of his entries, and historians who verified the real-world events mentioned in the text against his known locations at the time. It was a Herculean effort, a labor-intensive, exhausting, and precise dismantling of the defense's claims that required every ounce of the team's collective intelligence. As the court dates loomed, the city of London seemed to hold its breath. The weather turned gray and biting, mirroring the mood of the streets, where the name of the killer was whispered in shops, on buses, and in the quiet of kitchens. The case had transformed from a criminal investigation into a cultural moment, a reckoning with the past that forced everyone to look at the city not as a monument to history, but as a site of long-buried trauma. The diary remained the heart of the matter, its yellowed pages representing the difference between a life of freedom and a lifetime behind bars. For the investigators, the goal was clear. They had to ensure that the words written by the killer in the dark would be his final, inescapable testament to the world. The tension in the precinct reached a fever pitch in the final days before the proceedings began. The team members, exhausted and emotionally drained, found themselves returning to the scene of the 1978 crime, walking the alleyway in the dead of night, trying to place themselves in the shoes of the victim, trying to understand the final moments of a life that had been snatched away for no reason other than the whim of a man who wrote it all down in a book. It was an act of penance, a way of grounding their work in the human cost that the diary had reduced to mere ink. They knew that their work would define the rest of their lives, that they would be the ones to carry the story of the diary into the history books, and they approached it with the solemnity of people who had been tasked with a sacred duty. The killer, now moved to a high-security holding facility, remained a cipher, a man who had successfully lived in the margins of society and who was now being forced into the harsh, uncompromising glare of the spotlight. He had spent his life watching, and now he was being watched by everyone. The irony was not lost on the investigators, who recognized that the true punishment for a man like him was not just the sentence, but the stripping away of the invisibility he had worked so hard to cultivate. He was being seen, he was being known, and he was being held accountable. It was the only justice they could offer, and it was a victory that, while long overdue, felt as significant as it was heavy. As the first day of the trial finally dawned, the city of London stood in a state of quiet, somber expectation. The court building, a fortress of law and order, was surrounded by a sea of people, their presence a testament to the fact that, even after 47 years, the memory of the victim had not been lost. The investigators, as they walked into the building, carried the diary in a secure, climate-controlled case, a relic of a nightmare that was about to be laid to rest. They were the ones who had found the truth, the ones who had kept it safe, and now, they were the ones who would place it before the eyes of the world. The trial would be the final, necessary chapter, the moment when the silence would finally be shattered, not by a whisper, but by the overwhelming, irrefutable voice of the truth. The journey was far from over, but as the bailiff opened the doors to the courtroom, the detectives knew that the darkness that had held the city in its grip for so long was finally being forced to retreat. The trial was the beginning of the end, a process that would strip away the final layers of the killer's defense and leave him exposed, just as he had left his victims, in the cold, unforgiving light of justice. The diary, the man who wrote it, and the city that had lived with its secret. They were all converging in this single moment of truth, a confluence of history, forensic science, and the persistent, unyielding demand for an answer. As they took their seats, the room went quiet, the weight of the past pressing down on them all, the air thick with the promise of a reckoning that had been 47 years in the making. The judge entered, the jury stood, and the process began, the slow, rhythmic, and absolutely necessary work of ensuring that what was once lost would finally, at last, be found. The courtroom felt like a cathedral of cold, unyielding reality as the trial commenced, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of repressed adrenaline. For the investigators who had spent nearly half a century chasing the ghost of the 1978 London cold case, this was not merely a legal proceeding, it was the moment of exorcism. They sat in the front rows, their posture rigid, their eyes fixed on the man who had occupied their thoughts for more than a third of their lives. The defendant, now a frail-looking man in a suit that hung loosely on his frame, appeared almost cartoonishly benign, a sharp contrast to the monstrous precision of the diary that sat as the primary exhibit upon the prosecution's table. He looked around the room with a distant, almost bored curiosity, as if he were a visitor observing a peculiar, foreign custom rather than the center of his own inescapable reckoning. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterstroke of restraint and terrifying narrative clarity. They didn't rely on hyperbole or emotional appeals. They let the facts, as recorded by the killer himself, do the work. They described the diary as a chronicle of calculated predation, a document that functioned as both a weapon and a legacy. They walked the jury through the timeline, weaving the abstract entries of the journal into the tangible, grim reality of the 1978 investigation. They showed photos of the original scene, the rain-slicked alley, the scattered personal effects, the absolute, crushing emptiness of a life cut short, and then placed them side by side with the corresponding pages from the diary. The synchronization was so precise, so unnervingly accurate, that a collective shudder seemed to ripple through the gallery. It wasn't just a confession, it was a victory lap written in ink, a record of a man who had felt so emboldened by his invisibility that he had decided to immortalize his transgressions. As the expert witnesses took the stand, the forensic linguists, the handwriting analysts, the criminal profilers, the trial entered a phase of intense, granular scrutiny. Each witness served to dismantle the defendant's attempt to claim the diary was a fabrication. The forensic experts detailed how the chemical composition of the ink matched the production standards of the late 70s, how the paper had aged exactly as one would expect from nearly 5 decades of storage, and how the idiosyncratic slips in the handwriting, the peculiar loops of a G, the hurried pressure of a T, matched the defendant's current handwriting to a mathematical certainty. It was a forensic tightening of the noose, a slow, methodical process that left the defense with nowhere to turn but to the most desperate of arguments. They tried to suggest that the killer had been coerced into writing it by an unnamed, more sinister third party, but the theory was so flimsy, so detached from the reality of the evidence, that it drew audible gasps of disbelief from the jury. The defendant's internal struggle, if he had won, was invisible. Throughout the testimony, he remained an enigma, a man who seemed to exist in a different dimension than the one inhabited by the lawyers, the judge, and the suffering family of the victim. There were moments, however, when the mask would flicker, when a specific entry was read aloud, one that detailed the victim's final moments with a clinical, almost musical appreciation for the violence of the act. The defendant's hands, resting on the table, would tense, his fingers splayed out like those of a spider. It was a small, almost imperceptible tell, but to the lead detective, it was a confirmation of the darkness that still lived behind those vacant, aging eyes. He was not a man who regretted what he had done. He was a man who resented being forced to relive it in a room full of people who were now empowered to take his life, or what was left of it, away. The victim's parents, now in their twilight years, were called to the stand. Their testimony was not a torrent of weeping, but a steady, rhythmic cadence of grief that had been honed by 47 years of unanswered questions. They spoke of the day their daughter had vanished, as if it had happened only hours before. They described the silence of the house after she was gone, the way the world had continued to turn while their own personal time had stopped in 1978. When they were shown the diary, when they were asked to look at the pages that contain the final, recorded moments of their child's existence, they didn't look away. They leaned in, their eyes scanning the words that had been written by the hand of the man sitting only a few feet away. It was a scene of such raw, quiet power that even the court reporter, a veteran of countless brutal trials, stopped typing for a moment, the only sound in the room the ragged, rhythmic breathing of the bereaved. Following their testimony, the mood in the courtroom underwent a subtle, darkening transformation. The case was no longer just about the diary. It was about the profound, generational theft that the killer had committed. The prosecution used this momentum to introduce the evidence of the other, secondary incidents hinted at in the journal. They called to the stand a series of women who had reported being followed, stalked, or harassed in the late 70s and early 80s, all in the same sector of London where the killer had lived. One by one, they told their stories, describing the chilling sensation of being watched, the way a certain man, always the same description, always the same unsettling, flat gaze, would appear at the periphery of their lives, only to vanish when they sought help. These were not direct witnesses to the 1978 murder, but they provided the context that had been missing. The killer had been a consistent, active threat, a predator who had sharpened his blades on the lives of others long before he claimed his victim. The defense attorney, a man whose reputation was built on his ability to find the tiny, microscopic flaw in a prosecution's narrative, looked increasingly diminished as the days wore on. His cross-examinations were becoming shorter, more desperate, more reliant on technicalities that the judge was visibly impatient with. He was fighting a war against history, against the immutable record that the diary provided, and he was losing on every front. He tried to argue that the diary was a fantasy, a dark psychodrama that had been taken too seriously by a police force desperate for a resolution, but the sheer volume of corroborating evidence, the dates, the names, the locations, made his argument sound like the rantings of a man trapped in a burning building. The jury, a diverse cross-section of Londoners, watched him with a mixture of pity and growing irritation, their attention repeatedly drawn back to the defendant, who sat as still as a statue, a monument to a lifetime of calculated deceit. As the second week of the trial drew to a close, the judge ordered the jury to prepare for deliberations, but not before the final, damning evidence was presented: the reconstruction of the killer's path on the night of the murder. Using modern geospatial software, the prosecution mapped out the killer's movements that night based on the diary's timestamps, showing how he had positioned himself, how he had tracked his prey, and how he had retreated back into the city, blending into the very population that would spend the next half-century searching for him. It was a digital rendering of a ghost story, a computer-generated visualization of a murder that had been committed in the fog of 1978. The precision was breathtaking. It transformed the diary from a document of confession into a scientific proof of guilt. The defendant, for the first time, looked truly disturbed, his eyes darting to the screen as if it were a mirror reflecting his own inevitable end. The trial was approaching its climax, and the atmosphere in the building was electric. Reporters, international media, and members of the public who had lined up for hours in the biting London cold were all gripped by the same, singular question: what happens when a secret this deep, a darkness this old, finally meets the light of law? The investigators felt the weight of their long, arduous journey. They were the ones who had held the line, who had refused to let the 1978 case become just another entry in a dusty cabinet. They were the ones who had forced the city to look at its own history. And as they walked out of the courtroom at the end of the day, the London skyline looming dark and foreboding against the winter sky, they felt a strange, chilling realization. They hadn't just solved a crime. They had reached the end of a long, dark tunnel, only to realize that the world on the other side was just as filled with secrets as the one they had left behind. The trial was the final, formal acknowledgement of the monster in their midst, but the true, deep-seated trauma of the crime, the way it had shaped the lives of everyone it touched, was something that would continue to ripple through the city an echo that would never truly die. Inside the quiet of the empty courtroom, the diary remained on the table, a lonely, yellowed relic of malice. It had done its work. It had outlived its author's anonymity. It had outlasted the comfort of the city's indifference, and it had finally become the instrument of justice. For the detectives, the diary was more than just a piece of evidence. It was the final word in a conversation they had been having with the shadows for 47 years. They knew that the verdict, whatever it might be, was only the final, legal step. The true resolution had already happened. The moment the diary was opened, the moment the mask had been ripped away, and the moment the city had finally been forced to confront the truth of its own capacity for horror. They were ready for the end, ready to hand the history over to the public, and ready to walk away, knowing that they had finally, at long last, done exactly what they had sworn to do in that long ago, rain-swept morning of 1978. The case was finally coming home. The deliberation phase began, and the London courthouse entered a state of suspended animation, a period of heavy, suffocating silence that felt like the world was holding its breath. For the jurors, the transition from observers to arbiters of fate was a profound, almost traumatic leap. They were tasked with reconciling the evidence of the diary, this intimate, chilling confession of a life lived in the shadows, with the reality of the man sitting in the defendant's chair. Every detail, from the ink-stained fingerprints on the aged pages to the meticulous, terrifyingly precise descriptions of the victim's final moments, was now their burden to weigh. They moved to the sequestered room, their expressions etched with the gravity of the decision before them, and for the families waiting in the gallery, the hours that followed were a grueling, agonizing test of endurance. Outside the courtroom, the city of London continued to pulse with its own indifferent rhythm, yet there was a palpable shift in the air, a collective consciousness of the reckoning that was underway. The media had turned their attention to the broader implications of the case, questioning how the Metropolitan Police had failed so spectacularly in 1978 and how many other unsolved mysteries were actually the work of individuals like the defendant, hiding in the plain sight of their own anonymity. The diary had become more than just a piece of evidence. It had become a symbol of the limitations of the past and the relentlessness of the future. The public, who had long ago accepted the cold case as a permanent, unsolvable tragedy, were now forced to grapple with the knowledge that the past is never truly buried. It is only waiting for the right moment to surface. Inside the jury room, the dynamic was a mirror of the society that had produced them. There were those who were immediately convinced by the forensic weight of the diary, those who were haunted by the victim's parents' testimony, and those who remained deeply skeptical, wary of the possibility that the defense had planted a seed of doubt about the diary's authenticity. The deliberations were not a simple exercise in logic. They were a profound, agonizing confrontation with the nature of human depravity. They pored over the diary, reading entries that described not just the murder, but the mundane, terrifying details of a killer's daily life. What he ate, the songs he heard on the radio, the weather he observed as he stalked his prey. It was the juxtaposition of these banal realities with the horrific finality of his actions that proved the most harrowing for the jurors to process. The defense attorney, sensing the momentum shifting, made one final, desperate bid to cast doubt, filing a motion to suppress certain pages of the diary on the grounds that they were inadmissible as hearsay. It was a tactical, cold-blooded move, a last-ditch effort to save his client from the inevitable, and it backfired spectacularly. The judge, in a blistering rebuke, denied the motion, stating that the diary was not hearsay. It was the defendant's own, uncoerced record of his reality. The courtroom exploded into a hushed frenzy, the gallery erupting in a wave of suppressed whispers and sharp, intake-of-breath reactions. The message was clear. The law would not allow the defendant to hide behind legal abstractions when the evidence of his own hand was so absolute. The victim's family, meanwhile, had reached a point of absolute, meditative stillness. They had spent 47 years in a state of mourning that never fully abated, and they now understood that the verdict would not fix the hole in their lives. It would only provide a final, definitive account of the theft that had occurred in 1978. They were waiting for the truth to be validated, for the name of their daughter to be restored to a narrative that was no longer dominated by the mystery of her absence. They were the moral anchors of the trial, their presence a constant, unblinking reminder of the human cost of the crime. When they looked at the defendant, they didn't see the man he was today. They saw the monster he had been nearly half a century ago, the man who had stolen the future of someone they loved more than life itself. As the days turned into a week, the pressure in the courtroom became almost tangible, a physical weight that pressed against the walls and the windows. The investigators, who had been the architects of this long-awaited conclusion, found themselves standing on the periphery, watching the process they had initiated move toward its inevitable finish. They felt a sense of strange, melancholic detachment. They had dedicated their lives to this moment, yet as it arrived, they found that the triumph was muted by the realization of the sheer, wasted potential of the 47 years they had lost. They were looking at a killer who had lived a full, unburdened life, while their own lives had been defined by the pursuit of his shadow. It was a hard, bitter reality to accept, but it was the price of the badge, the cost of the commitment to a truth that refused to be silenced. Finally, the word came down. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was cleared and then rapidly refilled, the air thick with an anticipation so sharp it could cut through the dark. The families were seated, the lawyers were positioned, and the defendant was brought back from the holding cells, his demeanor still strangely, disturbingly composed. He didn't look at the gallery, he didn't look at the detectives, and he didn't look at the judge. He looked at the floor, his entire life narrowed down to the small, square tile beneath his feet. The judge took the bench, her face a mask of official, solemn impartiality, and asked the foreperson of the jury to stand. The silence that followed was an eternity, a vacuum in which every heartbeat seemed to echo against the wood-paneled walls. "How do you find the defendant on the charge of murder?" The voice of the foreperson was steady, clear, and devoid of tremor. "Guilty." The word felt like a physical impact, a hammer blow that shattered the lingering tension of the last 2 weeks. There was no eruption of joy in the courtroom, no cheering, no outbursts, only a deep, collective sigh that seemed to deflate the entire room. The victim's mother let out a small, quiet sob, a sound that was at once a release of decades of pain and a recognition of the finality of the moment. The defendant didn't flinch. He didn't offer a final statement, he didn't express a moment of remorse, and he didn't even acknowledge the verdict. He remained a cipher, a man who had finally run out of runway, a predator who had been forced to face the consequence of his own, long-hidden actions. The judge began the process of sentencing, her voice a measured, rhythmic cadence, but the reality was already set. The man who had been a phantom since 1978 was now a ward of the state, his future officially and irrevocably behind him. The investigators looked at each other, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a marathon that had finally reached its finish line. They had done it. They had closed the book, they had provided the answer, and they had honored the memory of the victim. But as they filed out of the courtroom, the reality of the aftermath began to settle in. The verdict was the end of the trial, but it was the beginning of a different kind of reality. They were no longer the men who were hunting a killer. They were the men who had caught one, and they now had to find a way to navigate a world where the primary source of their purpose had been removed. They were the stewards of a solved mystery, the guardians of a truth that was now, for better or for worse, a matter of public record. The City of London, receiving the news of the verdict, reacted with a mixture of shock, relief, and a strange, lingering disquiet. The cold case was over, but the questions it had raised, about safety, about the nature of evil, and about the permanence of the past, would continue to resonate in the dark, rainy streets for generations. The diary, the man, and the murder would become a part of the city's dark, indelible history, a story that would be told and retold, a myth that had finally been grounded in the hard, unforgiving reality of the law. The detectives, as they emerged into the biting winter air, felt the weight of their own lives beginning to reassert itself. They were finally, after 47 years, free to walk the city without the shadow of the diary following their every step. The case was solved, the ledger was balanced, and the truth had finally, at long last, claimed its final, unyielding victory in the heart of the London dark. The courtroom emptied, the heavy oak doors closing with a thud that resonated like a tombstone falling into place, leaving the investigators in a hollow, echoing silence that felt entirely foreign. For nearly half a century, the 1978 London case had been a living, breathing entity, a monstrous companion that walked with them through every shift, every holiday, and every personal milestone. Now, with the verdict secured and the killer effectively erased from the society he had so cruelly manipulated, that entity had simply ceased to exist. They stood in the dim, golden light of the afternoon hallway, the suits they wore feeling like costumes of a life they had outgrown, looking at one another with the dazed expressions of soldiers who had survived a war only to find the battlefield abandoned. There was no exhilaration, no triumphant cheering, only an immense, weary satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that the closure they had provided was a cold, forensic comfort that could never touch the true, enduring tragedy of the loss. They began the final, administrative task of decommissioning the investigation, the cataloging of the evidence, the return of the diary to the archives of the state, and the final, exhaustive filing of reports that would be sealed away in the subterranean record rooms of the police department. Each box they packed, each file they taped shut, felt like the closing of a door on a part of their own souls. The diary, once a pulsing, vibrant object of terror, was now reduced to a series of catalog numbers, its power to haunt formally neutralized by the legal process. They placed it in a secure, climate-controlled bin, watching as the lid was fastened shut, knowing that its future would be a quiet one, resting in the darkness of an official vault, away from the eyes of those it had once tormented. It was the only way to treat a record of such profound evil, not as a relic of history, but as a dangerous, volatile object that needed to be contained. The victim's family, meanwhile, had begun the slow, agonizing process of returning to a life that had been fundamentally broken. They had seen the man who stole their daughter, they had heard the verdict, and they had walked out of the court into a world that felt fundamentally the same, yet utterly alien. They didn't seek out the media, they didn't ask for interviews, and they didn't attempt to narrate their own healing to the public. They simply retreated into the private, quiet landscape of their grief, finally able to mourn in a world that acknowledged the crime for what it was. The detectives, observing this final withdrawal from a distance, felt a profound, aching respect for their restraint. They had been the silent, enduring center of the tragedy, and their ability to emerge from the trial without demanding blood, without performing their suffering for the cameras, was the most profound act of grace the investigators had ever witnessed. As the news of the conviction settled into the consciousness of the city, London began to undergo its own internal transformation. The case became a reference point, a dark milestone in the city's post-war history. Schools, universities, and law enforcement academies began to integrate the diary and the investigation into their curricula, using it as a case study for the evolution of criminal investigation and the persistent, unyielding power of forensic evidence. The killer, now a forgotten man in a concrete cell, had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of the banality of evil and the inevitability of justice, however delayed. The city, which had spent decades living in a state of subconscious unease, now found it could breathe a little deeper, the fog of the mystery finally lifting to reveal a London that was more resilient, more aware, and more committed to the pursuit of the truth than it had ever been. The lead investigator, a man who had entered the force with a head of dark hair and a heart full of idealistic fire, now stood on the precipice of retirement, his life measured by the files he had closed and the cases he had carried in the quiet of his own mind. He spent his final evening at the precinct walking the halls that had been the stage for the search, the place where the ghost of the 1978 investigation had been both his tormentor and his constant guide. He found himself at the evidence locker, the place where the diary had once been held, and felt a sudden, sharp, and overwhelming sense of peace. The case was solved. The debt was paid. The long, dark night that had started in that rain-slicked alleyway in 1978 had finally run its course. He walked out of the building, the cool, damp air of a London evening greeting him like an old friend, and for the first time in his life, He didn't feel the need to look over his shoulder for the shadow that had always been there. The transition to a life without the case was not immediate. It was a slow, quiet erosion of the habits of a lifetime. The detectives found that they had to learn how to exist without the constant, gnawing urgency of the investigation. They had to learn how to sleep without the diary in their thoughts, how to interact with their families without the shield of their professional stoicism, and how to define themselves without the pursuit of the killer. It was a terrifying, beautiful process of reconstruction, a way of building a new self from the ashes of the old. Some found it easier than others, finding solace in the quiet hobbies of their retirement, gardening, woodworking, traveling to places where the name of their city was just on a map, while others remained tethered to the work, taking on the role of mentors for the next generation of detectives, passing down the lessons they had learned in the hard, unforgiving school of the 1978 case. The diary, though physically absent, remained a constant, intangible presence in their lives. It was the yardstick by which they measured the reality of their existence, the object that had proven that even the most perfect, secret crimes can be undone by the passage of time. They found that they could not discuss the case with outsiders, even those closest to them, because the depth of the experience, the sheer weight of the 47 years of pursuit, was something that no one else could ever truly grasp. It was a shared, silent language, a bond between the men of the squad that had been forged in the dark and solidified by the truth. They were a secret order, the keepers of the London story, and their bond was the only thing that could bridge the gap between the man they had been and the man they had become. The city continued to evolve, the scars of the past beginning to fade into the fabric of the modern metropolis. New generations grew up with no memory of the fear that had once defined the neighborhood, their lives untouched by the shadow of the man from the diary. They saw the city as a place of endless possibility, a vibrant, chaotic, and ever-changing center of culture and life, and the investigators, watching from the periphery, were glad for it. They had done their part. They had ensured that the future was free of the haunting that had plagued them for so long. They were the silent witnesses to the city's renewal, the ones who had held the line so that others could walk the streets in peace. As the years began to accumulate, the story of the London Diary started to lose its sharp, terrifying edges, becoming something that felt more like a fable than a historical reality. It was a process that the detectives watched with a mixture of amusement and philosophical acceptance. They knew that the truth is often a fragile thing, susceptible to the distortions of memory and the demands of the narrative, but they also knew that the truth didn't need to be perfectly preserved in the public consciousness to be valid. It had been written, it had been verified, and it had been proven in a court of law. The reality of the victim's life and the reality of the killer's death had been established, and that was all that truly mattered. The rest, the books, the podcasts, the sensationalized retellings, was just the background noise of the city, the static of a world that had moved on. The lead investigator, in the final years of his life, would occasionally revisit the city, walking the streets of his old neighborhood, trying to find the trace of the man he used to be. He would find the alleyway, now transformed by the modernization of the area, and he would stand there for a moment, listening to the echoes of the city's pulse. He would think of the girl, he would think of the diary, and he would think of the long, arduous journey they had taken together through the fog of the past. It was a life well lived, a life that had been given meaning by the pursuit of an answer, and as he turned to leave, he felt nothing but a quiet, profound sense of gratitude. The case was solved, the ledger was balanced, and the truth, that stubborn, unyielding, and beautiful thing, had finally claimed its place in the heart of the city, a light that would continue to burn long after the shadows had been chased into the dark. He walked into the fading light, the city around him moving with a vibrant, relentless energy that no longer felt like a threat. He was a part of the city, a part of its history, and a part of the long, unfolding story of its resilience. The case of 1978 was his legacy, his contribution to the fabric of the city, and as he faded into the crowd, he felt a final, overwhelming sense of peace. The diary was gone, the killer was gone, and the tragedy had been transformed into a story of justice. He had finished his work, and the London of the future would be a little safer, a little lighter, and a little more aware because of the man who had stayed in the dark for 47 years to make sure the truth was finally, inevitably, found. The long hunt was over, and in the silence of the evening, there was only the sound of a city breathing, living, and moving forward, forever changed by the memory of the light they had found in the dark. The aftermath of the trial was a long, slow cooling of the embers, a period where the City of London seemed to exhale a collective breath it had been holding for nearly half a century. The detectives who had spearheaded the hunt for the man behind the diary found themselves in a state of profound psychological deceleration. For decades, their lives had been governed by the frantic, sharp-edged rhythm of the cold case, the sudden bursts of hope, the crushing troughs of despair, and the constant, background hum of the victim's ghost calling for justice. Now, with the predator behind bars and the truth codified in legal volumes, that rhythm had abruptly stopped. It was not a celebratory quiet. It was the eerie, disorienting silence of a machine that had been running at full tilt for a lifetime, suddenly cut from its power source. They returned to their homes, to families who had learned to live alongside the specter of the 1978 case, and discovered that the absence of the investigation was just as disruptive as its presence had been. They were men who had been defined by the pursuit of an invisible monster, and without that target, they felt a strange, existential weightlessness. The lead investigator found himself sitting in his study, surrounded by the detritus of his career. Old notebooks, maps of the city that were now obsolete, and photographs of crime scenes that had long since been renovated out of existence. He would stare at these objects, trying to reconcile the man he had been in 1978 with the man he was in 2026. He realized that the diary had been more than a tool of justice. It had been the primary narrative of his existence. To lose it was to lose the very anchor that had kept him steady through the storms of his professional life. Yet, as the months progressed, a new, more sober understanding began to take root. The detectives realized that their true contribution was not merely the conviction of one man, but the disruption of the culture of silence that had allowed him to flourish. By bringing the diary into the light, they had effectively dismantled the myth of the perfect crime, the idea that a predator could hide forever in the folds of a city's indifference. They had provided a template for future investigations, a roadmap showing that even the most deeply buried secrets are subject to the erosive power of time and the relentless persistence of forensic science. This was their true legacy, a quiet, enduring contribution that would echo through the precinct long after their names had been forgotten. The city, meanwhile, was undergoing its own process of internal assimilation. Londoners, having been confronted with the horror of the diary, became a more vigilant, more connected populace. The neighborhood watch programs, the community initiatives, and the spontaneous, informal networks of support that began to sprout across the boroughs were all, in some measure, a reaction to the trial. The city had realized its own vulnerability, and in response, it had built a protective, social skin. They were no longer the indifferent, atomized society of 1978. They were a community that recognized the necessity of witnessing, of acknowledging the presence of the other, and of refusing to look away when something felt wrong. The ghost of the 1978 victim had become, in a sense, the city's conscience. The victim's family, having finally achieved their legal resolution, began to engage in a quiet, philanthropic mission. They used the settlement from the trial to establish a foundation dedicated to the support of families of the missing and the long-term victims of violent crime. They weren't seeking fame or public recognition. They were seeking to turn the raw, jagged edges of their own tragedy into something that could help others navigate the labyrinthine, often cold-blooded processes of the justice system. The detectives were invited to the Foundation's quiet, unassuming office in the heart of the city, and there, they saw the final, most profound evidence of the case's resolution, a group of people who had been devastated by the past, now working to ensure that the future held more light. This transformation of grief into action was the final, necessary act of the tragedy. The detectives found themselves serving as advisors to the Foundation, their deep, institutional knowledge of the cold case process providing a valuable perspective for families who were at the beginning of their own long journeys. They weren't detectives anymore. They were guides. They understood the bureaucracy, they understood the emotional toll, and they understood the, at times, crushing indifference of the legal machine. They were able to offer the one thing they had been denied for most of their careers, a sense of shared purpose and the reassurance that they were not alone in the dark. This became their new rhythm, their new anchor, a cycle of support that allowed them to finally let go of the specific trauma of 1978 and embrace the broader, universal struggle for justice. The archive, though bricked over and forgotten by the precinct's leadership, remained a source of quiet, contemplative strength for the retired detectives. They would occasionally meet at a small, nondescript pub near the old station, the air thick with the history of the city, and they would talk, not about the diary, not about the horror, but about the future. They spoke of the new recruits, the bright, eager men and women who were now taking up the mantle of the Metropolitan Police, and they felt a flicker of cautious, well-earned optimism. The city was changing, the tools of the trade were evolving, and the moral landscape was, bit by bit, becoming more defined by transparency and accountability. They were proud of their role in that evolution, even if no one else would ever know the full extent of the struggle they had endured. The diary itself, now sitting in the cold, climate-controlled depths of the State Archive, had lost its ability to cause fear. It was no longer the manifesto of a monster. It was merely a document, an artifact, a testament to a specific moment in the city's dark history. It had been robbed of its power by the verdict, reduced from a weapon of terror to a piece of evidence in a closed file. This was the final, and perhaps most important, victory. The detectives had stripped the killer of his greatest advantage, his ability to control the narrative, to dictate the terms of his existence, and to remain an enigma. They had pinned his story to the board, labeled it, and filed it away, ensuring that it could never again hurt anyone, never again threaten the peace, and never again remain a mystery. As they grew older, the investigators found that the memory of the case became less a burden and more a kind of internal, private treasure. It was a story that defined their lives, yes, but it was also a story that taught them the absolute, undeniable value of the truth. They had looked at the worst of humanity, they had lived through the collapse of their own expectations, and they had come out the other side with a belief that, however flawed the system, however slow the justice, the truth remains the only thing that ultimately holds the world together. They had seen the dark, and they had survived it, and in doing so, they had become the architects of their own final piece. The City of London, in its grand, sprawling, and ever-moving complexity, continued to grow, its history a deep, interconnected web of light and shadow. The story of the diary would eventually pass into the realm of local folklore, a whispered tale that would be told to newcomers as a warning of the city's capacity for both dark secrets and hard-won light. The detectives were fine with that. They didn't need the world to remember their names. They only needed the truth to stand. And as they walked the city streets for the last few times, feeling the vibration of the life they had helped to protect, they knew that the 1978 case was no longer a ghost that haunted them. It was a foundation upon which they had built the rest of their lives. They had reached a state of perfect, serene closure. The hunt was over, the monster was gone, and the truth had been spoken. As the lead detective stood one last time on the banks of the Thames, watching the water churn in the dark, he felt the final release. He was no longer the man in the alley. He was no longer the seeker of the diary. He was simply a man, standing in the heart of a city that he loved, breathing in the cool, damp, and perfectly ordinary air. The mystery was gone, the shadows were gone, and all that remained was the vast, unfolding future, a future that was finally and beautifully his own. He turned away from the river, the city lights shimmering in the mist, and began the long, steady walk home, his steps light, his conscience clear, and his heart finally, at long last, at rest. The diary was closed, the story was written, and the truth, that bright and burning star, was finally, forever, home. The transition into the post-case era was less a linear progression and more an atmospheric settling, a slow descent from the peak of an adrenaline-fueled obsession into the flatlands of mundane daily existence. The detectives, once defined by the jagged intensity of the 1978 investigation, now found themselves wandering through the corridors of their own lives like people who had returned from a long, arduous journey to a land that had forgotten them. The precinct, once a theater of constant, high-stakes combat against the unknown, had become a quiet, functional office where the new generation of officers, bright-eyed, digitally adept, and utterly removed from the analog era of the diary, moved with a casual, almost reckless efficiency. They looked at the veterans not with the reverence of heirs to a dark history, but with the mild, distant curiosity one reserves for relics of a bygone era. This generational friction was, in its own way, a final, necessary severing of ties. The veterans realized that the specific horror of the diary was a relic of a time that no longer existed, a time before the ubiquity of surveillance, before the hyperconnectivity of the digital age, before the world had been mapped and catalogued in every conceivable dimension. Their fight had been a struggle against the entropy of paper and the volatility of memory. The new fight was against the entropy of data and the volatility of transparency. They were the last of the detectives who had navigated the city by intuition and sheer, brute force legwork, and as they handed over the mantle, they felt a sense of profound, protective relief. The city was in good hands, even if those hands would never know the specific, localized terror that had shaped their own professional identities. The lead detective found that he had developed a habit of visiting the city's libraries, not to research or to find answers, but to sit among the stacks and immerse himself in the sheer, overwhelming abundance of human history. It was a form of professional deprogramming. He needed to be reminded that the world was more than just a crime scene, more than just a puzzle waiting to be solved. He would pull books from the shelves, histories of the city, collections of poetry, accounts of architecture, and lose himself in the breadth of it all, letting the specific, obsessive details of the diary be washed away by the tide of broader, more encompassing stories. It was in the quiet, dusty aisles of these libraries that he finally began to reclaim his own life, piece by piece, from the grip of the case. The camaraderie of the former squad had also evolved. They no longer met to discuss the trial, the evidence, or the mechanics of the arrest. Their gatherings had become more intimate, more grounded in the reality of their aging bodies and the quiet, domestic rhythms of their post-service lives. They spoke of their grandchildren, the challenges of their gardens, and the peculiar, slow-moving pace of a life that no longer required the constant, alert maintenance of a predator-hunter. They were men who had been through the fire together, and that shared history was now the only bridge they needed. They didn't need to name the ghost. They only needed to know that the other person understood the shape of the shadow it had cast. The victim's family foundation, meanwhile, had begun to grow, its influence rippling outward into the city's social services. It wasn't just providing resources for the missing, it was challenging the city's institutions to become more responsive to the needs of the marginalized, to address the systemic gaps that had allowed someone like the killer to operate with impunity for so long. The detectives were often invited to speak at these gatherings, not as police officers, but as witnesses to the necessity of systemic change. They would stand before the audience, their voices steady and their demeanor calm, and they would talk about the importance of being present, of noticing the anomaly, and of refusing to accept the narrative of the unsolvable. They were the architects of a new, more aware city, a London that had been forced to learn that the safety of the individual is inextricably linked to the responsiveness of the collective. One afternoon, the lead detective found himself standing on a bridge overlooking the Thames, the same river he had walked alongside 47 years ago while he agonized over the dead-end leads of the 1978 case. The city had changed around him. The skyline was a jagged, modern masterpiece of glass and steel. The river banks were manicured and bustling, and the air was cleaner, thinner, more modern. Yet, the river remained the same ancient, dark, and churning body of water that had been a silent witness to everything. He looked at the reflection of the city in the water and saw the traces of the past interwoven with the present, a seamless, interconnected flow that could never be fully disentangled. He realized that the city was not a collection of individual moments, but a living, breathing history, and that he was just a small, fleeting part of it. This realization brought him a final, profound clarity. The mystery of the diary hadn't been a detour in his life. It had been the central, clarifying event, the crucible in which his understanding of humanity had been tested and forged. He had seen the depths to which a human being could sink, but he had also seen the heights to which a city could rise when it was finally, brutally forced to confront the truth of its own shadow. He had been a part of that transition, a small but essential cog in the machine that had dragged the secret into the light, and as he stood there, watching the water flow toward the sea, he felt a final, overwhelming sense of completion. There was nothing left to do. There was nothing left to say. The case was solved, the city was moving forward, and he was finally, at long last, just a man in the world. He walked away from the river, the bustling noise of the city rising up around him like a tide. He didn't look back. He didn't feel the need to trace the steps he had taken on that night in 1978, nor did he feel the need to revisit the alleyway or the precinct or any of the landmarks of the hunt. They were markers of a life that had been lived, but they were no longer the coordinates of his existence. He was walking toward the future, toward his home, toward the quiet, predictable, and profoundly ordinary life he had earned, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the weight of the diary in his pocket. He was light, he was free, and he was ready for whatever the evening would bring. As he turned a corner and merged into the flow of the London crowd, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a storefront window. He looked like any other old man, his coat collar turned up against the breeze, his face lined with the slow, steady progress of the years. There was no trace of the detective left, no shadow of the hunter, just a man navigating the vibrant, messy, and indifferent beauty of the city. He smiled, a small, private gesture that was entirely his own, and continued walking, his pace steady, his gaze forward, and his mind finally and beautifully empty. The diary was closed. The story was told. And the truth, that bright and burning, simple thing, was finally home. The night was soft, the city was alive, and for the first time, in all the ways that truly mattered, he was finally at peace. The hunt was a dream of the past, the archive was a tomb for the truth, and the world, the vast, sprawling, and unending world, was waiting. He stepped into the light, his silhouette blending into the movement of the city, and he was gone. The case was done. The truth remained. And the city, that grand, eternal, and complicated London, went on, its secrets kept, its history lived, and its silence finally, and perfectly, broken. The quietude that descended upon the veteran squad was not the absence of history, but the physical manifestation of its weight, a silence that carried the texture of decades. As the lead detective settled into the rhythms of his final autumn, the sensation of being untethered became his new, permanent landscape. He often found himself sitting in the small, sun-drenched garden behind his home, a space he had meticulously cultivated, yet his mind would inevitably drift back to the geography of the investigation. He would map out the streets of London in his memory, tracing the paths he had walked as a younger man, the same streets that had once been the stage for a predator's unchecked movement. It was a strange, haunting form of internal cartography. He was no longer trying to solve a crime. He was simply cataloging the topography of a memory, ensuring that the details did not erode under the slow, steady pressure of time. There was a profound, almost liturgical dignity in this act of remembering. He realized that the city, in its relentless pursuit of progress, would eventually pave over the sites of their struggle, turning the alleyways of 1978 into the foundations of high-end lofts and tech-forward workspaces. He didn't resent this. He saw it as the city's inherent, necessary mercy, a way of allowing the residents to live without the immediate, crushing reminder of the past. Yet, he felt a responsibility to remain the steward of those places. If the city would not remember, he would. If the archives were bricked over and forgotten, he would keep the record clear in the archive of his own consciousness. It was a solitary, quiet burden, but he carried it with the same discipline that had defined his career. He began to notice the ways in which his fellow detectives were also negotiating this final phase of their lives. They no longer spoke of the case, but they communicated through a series of knowing, wordless gestures when they saw one another at the local cafes or the infrequent, formal functions of the force. There was a shared language of the eyes, a mutual acknowledgement of the dark things they had witnessed and the truth they had finally brought into the light. It was a brotherhood that required no verbal validation. It was a bond forged in the crucible of a decades-long pursuit. They were the men who had looked at the diary and seen not just a document, but the roadmap of a human life lost to the void. They were the ones who had made the choice to notice. One evening, he received a letter, a simple, handwritten note from the victim's youngest brother, a man who had been a child when the tragedy occurred and who had grown up in the shadow of an empty chair. The letter did not ask for details. It did not ask for comfort. It simply thanked him for the persistence of his search. The words were sparse, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of questions. He read the note over and over, the ink blurring slightly in the fading light of the afternoon. He realized then that their work had never been about the killer, nor about the diary, nor even about the legal victory. It had been about the family, the people whose lives had been redirected by the violence of one man, and the way that, in the end, their need for story had been the silent, guiding force behind everything the squad had done. He took the note and placed it inside an old, leather-bound book on a shelf, a volume that sat right next to the journals he had written during the months of the trial. He felt no need to show it to anyone. It was a private validation, the final piece of the puzzle that had been missing for all those years. He had done what he was supposed to do. He had answered the question. And as he looked out over the quiet, suburban street, he realized that he could finally stop being the detective. He could just be a man. He could just be a human being, living in the light, surrounded by the people who knew him as he was, not as the shadow hunter he had been for so long. The transition from the role of hunter to the role of neighbor, friend, and grandfather was the most significant shift of his entire life. He found that the same tenacity he had used to track a killer could be applied to the simple, beautiful tasks of human connection. He learned the names of the local shopkeepers, he took an interest in the local school board, and he found joy in the simple, predictable nature of the neighborhood's growth. He was building something new, something that was not defined by death or injustice, but by the quiet, daily persistence of life itself. The city had once been a labyrinth of threats. It was now just a community of people, each with their own untold stories, each struggling with their own private burdens. He started to see the city as a living, breathing organism that was constantly shedding its past to survive. The 1978 case was a scar, yes, but it was a scar that had healed, a reminder of a wound that had long since been treated. He stopped looking for the darkness. He stopped expecting the worst. He learned to trust the silence, not as a sign of something being hidden, but as the natural, peaceful state of a city that had finally moved on. It was a profound, spiritual liberation. He was no longer the detective, and in a world where he no longer felt the need to solve, he found a freedom that was as boundless as the sky above him. As winter began to make its presence felt, the lead detective found himself spending more time at home, the warmth of his fireplace a stark contrast to the cold, damp alleyways he had patrolled in his memory. He would watch the snow drift down against the window panes, a quiet, white blanket erasing the jagged edges of the world. It was a beautiful, peaceful image, a metaphor for the way the truth had finally allowed the past to settle. The chaos of the investigation, the intensity of the trial, and the agonizing, slow march of the years had all led to this, a place of warmth, of stillness, and of absolute, unshakable peace. He had fulfilled his duty, he had served his purpose, and he had come home. There were times, in the deepest part of the night, when he would still dream of the diary. He would see the pages, the ink, and the chilling, meticulous handwriting of the man who had stolen so much. But the dream no longer carried the sting of helplessness. In the dream, he would simply close the book, set it aside, and walk away. He no longer felt the need to fight the monster in the dark. He had already won. He had brought the truth into the light, and that truth was now an immutable, eternal part of history. The monster was gone, the shadows had been dispersed, and the girl from 1978 was finally allowed to rest, her name no longer a question, but a memory held in the light of the truth. He knew that eventually, he too would pass into the history of the city, becoming just another name, another voice in the vast, interconnected story of London. He would be remembered by his family, by his friends, and perhaps by a few of the younger officers who had heard the stories of the long, cold hunt. But it didn't matter. The work was finished. The light had been found, the dark had been challenged, and the truth had been spoken. As he watched the firelight dance against the walls of his room, casting long, soft shadows that felt like the gentle ghosts of the past, he closed his eyes and felt the last of the tension bleed away. He was home. The diary was closed. And the truth, that bright, burning, and beautiful thing, was finally, forever, at rest. The case was solved, the history was settled, and the city, the beautiful, complex, and resilient city of London, was finally, truly moving forward. He drifted into sleep, the silence of the night no longer a threat, but a welcome, final embrace. He was no longer a detective. He was just a man. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The passage of time in the life of the retired lead investigator began to feel like the slow, rhythmic receding of a tide, leaving behind the polished, smooth stones of memory where once there had been the jagged, turbulent wreckage of a 47-year hunt. He found himself moving through his daily rituals, the morning tea, the walk to the local market, the evening reading, with a sense of detachment that was not born of indifference, but of a hard-won, meditative acceptance. The London that moved around him was no longer the city of his youth, nor was it the predatory landscape that had existed within the pages of the diary. It was a place of rapid, relentless evolution, a city that had effectively scrubbed away the physical traces of the 1978 crime, replacing the dark alleyways and the forgotten corners with a bright, efficient glass of modern architecture. This physical erasure was a comfort. It confirmed that the world, in its own way, was a collaborator in the process of healing. He often thought of the other detectives, picturing them in their own corners of retirement, perhaps enjoying the same sense of quiet, hard-earned resolution. They were the last members of a secret order, the keepers of the archives that no longer required guarding. They were the ones who knew the full, unvarnished story, the ones who had witnessed the interplay of darkness and light, and they were the ones who had been forged by that experience into something more resilient than the men they had been when they first donned the badge. They had been defined by the pursuit of the impossible, and now, in the sunset of their lives, they were defined by the simple, profound reality of being alive in a world that no longer demanded their constant, alert vigilance. The victim's family, who had long since moved beyond the public eye, were occasionally mentioned in the rare, private correspondence he kept with his former partners. They had created a life that was vibrant and full, a testament to the fact that grief, while permanent, does not have to be the terminal point of existence. Their success in building a life after the verdict was the detectives' most cherished evidence. It wasn't the conviction, the diary, or the forensic breakthrough that proved they had succeeded. It was the fact that a family had been able to walk out of the shadow of a 47-year tragedy and into the light of the present. They were the living victory, the human reclamation of a future that had been stolen. As he reflected on the diary, that object of terror that had once consumed his every waking thought, he found that its image in his mind had softened. It was no longer the manifesto of a monster, but a historical document, an artifact of a specific, dark moment in the city's life. It had been robbed of its power to dictate his existence, just as the killer had been robbed of his ability to operate in the darkness. The diary was a piece of the city's story, just as the stones of the bridge were, or the patterns of the rain against his window. It existed, it was known, and it was filed away. There was no more mystery to be solved, no more fear to be managed, and no more questions left to ask. The case was not just solved, it was understood, accepted, and finally, firmly, integrated into the history of the world. He began to devote himself to the study of the city's broader history, finding that the specific, narrow intensity of his career had left him with a deep, aching hunger for the larger, more inclusive stories of humanity. He spent hours in the city's museums, wandering through the galleries of ancient and medieval artifacts, finding comfort in the realization that London had survived 1,000 such tragedies, 1,000 such crimes, and 1,000 such dark times. The 1978 diary was not an anomaly. It was a part of the city's tapestry, a single, dark thread in an incredibly vast and intricate weaving. This perspective allowed him to see his own life and the lives of the victims, not as isolated, tragic accidents, but as part of a long, unfolding human narrative that was characterized as much by its resilience as by its suffering. His health, like the health of the city, was in a state of quiet, inevitable decline, but he didn't view this with the fear he might have felt when he was younger. He viewed it as the natural, rhythmic conclusion to a long, well-traveled path. He had been a seeker of truth, and he had found it. He had been a protector of the light, and he had kept it burning. He had lived a life of purpose, and he was satisfied with the legacy he would leave behind. The case was his, yes, but it was also the city's, and the way the city had responded to the truth, with resilience, with justice, and eventually with the quiet, healing passage of time, was the final, triumphant resolution he had been searching for. The night would often bring the old, familiar thoughts, but they were no longer the frantic, searching ones of a man trying to catch a ghost. They were reflective, contemplative thoughts of a man who had seen the whole of the picture. He would think of the girl, imagining her in the light of the city she had known, a life that had been full of potential, a light that had been extinguished too early. But the memory was no longer accompanied by the why. The why had been answered, the killer had been held accountable, and the story had been laid to rest. He realized that the memory of the girl was no longer a burden. It was a connection, a way of acknowledging the dignity of a life that had been snatched away. He remembered her, not as the victim of a cold case, but as a person, a part of the city's vibrant, unfolding history. The final days were defined by a profound, almost ethereal sense of stillness. He moved through his house, his movements slow and deliberate, touching the books, the artifacts, the journals, and the photographs that made up the architecture of his life. Everything was in its place. The story of the London Diary had been completed, the final page turned, and the book closed. He had done his part. He had been the one who had stayed in the dark, the one who had refused to give up, and the one who had finally, against all odds, brought the truth into the light. And as he sat by the fire, the shadows lengthening across the room, he knew that the story of the 1978 investigation would continue to live on, a quiet, enduring, and ultimately triumphant part of the city's heart, a story of the light that is found when one is brave enough to walk through the dark. The end did not feel like a conclusion, but a continuation, a seamless, graceful transition from the life of a seeker to the life of a part of history. He had played his role in the long, unfolding drama of London. He had fulfilled the promise he had made to himself and to the family of the victim, and he had earned his peace. The case was solved, the ledger was balanced, and the truth was held in the safe, enduring hands of history. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire a soft, comforting presence, and he felt the last of the world's demands fall away. He was home. The diary was forgotten. And the truth, that bright and burning star, was finally, forever, at rest. The city, the beautiful, complex, and resilient London, continued to breathe, to live, and to move forward, its history forever marked by the light they had found in the dark. The hunt was over, the mystery was gone, and the long, long, beautiful journey had finally, at long last, reached its destination. There was no more work to be done. There was only the stillness, the truth, and the absolute, perfect peace. The sun, a pale, diffused orb behind the perennial London mist, cast long, gray fingers across the room where the lead detective spent his final hours of conscious, active reflection. He was not waiting for an ending. He was witnessing the final stabilization of a lifelong equation. All the variables, the diary, the alleyway, the decades of frustration, the sudden, violent breakthrough of forensic science, the trial, the verdict had finally settled into their permanent configuration. The case was no longer a dynamic, shifting threat. It was a static, unmoving point in the history of the world. He understood now, with the clarity that only comes to those who have navigated the absolute depths of human malice, that his life's work had been a form of alchemy. He had taken the lead, the ink, and the despair and transmuted them into the cold, solid gold of the record. He looked around his room, at the stacks of books and the neatly organized papers that documented the broader history of the city he had served. The diary was gone, vanished into the state's abyss, and yet he felt its presence nowhere. It had been stripped of its ontological weight. It was just a book. He had successfully neutralized the terror of the object by exposing its contents to the light of the law. This, he realized, was the final function of a detective, not to defeat the darkness, for the darkness is an inherent, unkillable part of the human condition, but to contain it. He had been a containment vessel, a human filter that had taken the poison of the 1978 murder and channeled it through the institutions of justice until it was no longer lethal. His mind wandered to the city outside his window, a sprawling, ancient, and endlessly regenerating entity. He thought of the millions of lives being lived in that very moment, the collisions of joy and grief, the secrets being whispered in the dark, and the lies being maintained in the light. He knew that for every diary he had found, there were 1,000 others currently being written, currently being hidden under floorboards, currently being nurtured by the pride of men who believed they were smarter than the world. This thought did not bring him despair. It brought him a strange, cold, and profoundly objective perspective. He had stopped being a combatant in the war between light and shadow. He had become a historian of the skirmishes. The camaraderie he shared with the other retired members of the squad had shifted into a quiet, almost sacred silence. When they spoke, they didn't revisit the grisly details of the crime. They spoke of the mundane, the price of coffee, the difficulty of managing the encroaching cold, the minor, everyday inconveniences of living in a world that no longer demanded they carry the weight of a generation's trauma. They were like veteran soldiers who had left the front lines, recognizing in each other a secret language that didn't need to be spoken. They were the ones who knew that the true terror of the 1978 case wasn't just the murder, it was the 47 years of silence that followed. And they were the ones who had finally, against the gravity of that silence, dared to scream the truth. He found himself thinking about the nature of memory, how it is both a gift and a curse, how it sustains us and how it destroys us. The diary was a weapon of memory, a way for the killer to keep the girl forever in the state of her final, terrified moment. By bringing the diary into the light, the investigators had liberated the memory of the victim from the killer's possession. She was no longer just the subject of his entries. She was a woman whose name was spoken, whose death was mourned, and whose story was, at last, finished. They had performed a kind of secular resurrection. They had returned her memory to the world, taking it back from the man who had tried to hoard it in his dark, ink-stained pages. As the afternoon light began to fail, casting the room into a deep, velvety shade of violet, he felt a final, profound release of tension. The responsibility he had carried, the sense that he was the only one holding the line against the total, absolute erasure of the truth, was dissolving. He was no longer the protector. He was no longer the hunter. He was just a witness, and his testimony was complete. He had seen what he needed to see, he had done what he needed to do, and the world, that grand, messy, and eternal world, could continue without his intervention. It was a liberation of the spirit that felt like the final, perfect exhale. He thought of the city's archives, the physical ones, the ones that were eventually destined to be shredded or repurposed, and realized that the truth didn't need the preservation of paper. The truth was inscribed into the culture of the police department, into the institutional knowledge of the city's forensic labs, and into the very way Londoners understood the reality of their own safety. They were a more cautious, more aware, and more honest city than they had been in 1978. That was the legacy. That was the change. They had been forced to mature, and that maturity was the final, lasting victory of the investigation. He drifted into a state of semi-consciousness, the boundaries of his room blurring into the memories of the city he had served. He could hear the distant, rhythmic hum of London, the traffic, the wind, the low, steady vibration of a million lives in motion. It was the sound of existence itself, a symphony that had played on long before he had arrived, and would play on long after he had gone. And he was okay with that. He had been a part of the orchestra. He had played his part with the precision of a professional and the heart of a believer, and he had reached the end of his movement. The music was still playing, but he was finally ready to step off the stage. He found himself laughing, a quiet, dry, and entirely genuine sound. He was laughing at the absurdity of it all, the years spent hunting for a diary, the desperate belief that a book could be the center of the universe, and the realization that in the end, it was all so small, so finite, and so absolutely human. The monster was just a man. The crime was just an act. And the detective, the great, long-suffering detective, was just a man in a room, watching the sun go down. It was a moment of profound, liberating insignificance. He had spent his life fighting the dark, only to realize that the dark was just the background for the light, and he was the one who had finally, perfectly, found the balance. The diary, the case, the search, and the silence, they were all behind him now, integrated into the long, slow, and inevitable process of his own becoming. He closed his eyes, the image of the city's skyline lingering in his mind like a map of the heart. He was ready. The work was done. The truth was settled. And the night, for the first time in his life, was not a place of fear, but a place of absolute, unshakable peace. He was finally, in all the ways that mattered, home. He felt the weight of the years simply lift away, leaving him as light as a thought, as clear as the truth, and as quiet as the city under the snow. The long, long hunt was finally over. The mystery was a thing of the past. And he was, at last, just a man, breathing in the cold, clear, and perfectly ordinary air of his own final night. The case was solved. The truth was free. And he, the last of the seekers, was finally, forever, at rest. The world continued, the city breathed, and the long, dark journey ended exactly where it began. In the light, in the truth, and in the absolute, silent, and triumphant peace of a life lived for the sake of the story. The diary is closed. The city moves on. And he is finally, at long last, home.